Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Battle of Peachtree Creek, Hood's First Effort to Save Atlanta, by Earl J. Hess, narrated by Bob Souer. Preface. The midday sun was at its height on the afternoon of July 20th, 1864, as the men of George H. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland settled into position south of Peachtree Creek. The crossing had consumed many hours and was conducted in stages the day before and that morning. Now it was time for some of Thomas's units to construct rude field works, send out skirmishers, and consolidate their hold on the high ground just south of the stream. For other units, commanded by men who assumed there would be no fighting that day, there was an opportunity to lounge in the bottomland of the creek, fix a meal, and relax under the shade of trees. But then, without warning, battle flags appeared from the woods south of Thomas's new position, followed by division upon division of butternut-clad men. The Army of Tennessee was on the move, and its new commander, John Bell Hood, was making his first strike to save Atlanta. After falling back 60 miles from Dalton since early May, the Confederates attempted their first major attack on William T. Sherman's army group as the enemy closed in on the outskirts of Atlanta. Hood hoped to take advantage of the fact that his enemy had just made a difficult crossing of Peachtree Creek. His Confederates certainly took the Unionists by surprise. All along the developing battlefront, the Federals scrambled to get ready. Two potentially dangerous gaps in the line of the 20th Corps were waiting to be exploited by the onrushing enemy, and some other bits of high ground still had not been secured by Union commanders along the line. In short, there was reason for the Confederates to hope that Hood's plan might work to their benefit. Only 2 days in command of the Army of Tennessee, Hood had precious little time to acclimate himself to a position he had not wanted and for which he possessed few attributes to fill. But he did his best to plan, position, and inspire his men despite widespread dissatisfaction at the relief of their beloved general, Joseph E. Johnston, and the elevation of someone who had served in the Army of Tennessee for only 4 months. Whether his men could fulfill Hood's hope for a dramatic turnaround in rebel fortunes during the Atlantic campaign would be worked out before dusk fell on that hot and bloody day of fighting north of the city. This book tells the story of the Battle of Peachtree Creek, the Battle of July 20th, 1864, north of Atlanta. A successor to my studies of Kennesaw Mountain and Ezra Church, this book is also based on exhaustive research in primary sources and an examination of the ground. Its purpose is not only to detail the battle's history in narrative fashion, but to analyze and evaluate the major features of that history. Each phase of the Atlantic campaign possessed important aspects to explain the course of events from the May confrontation at Dalton to the final battle at Jonesboro in late August and early September. None of those phases were necessarily decisive in shaping the campaign, but all of them contributed to its contours and results. We need to understand each phase in its turn and how it contributed to the larger picture if we hope to understand one of the largest, most important, and most interesting campaigns of the Civil War. The Battle of Peachtree Creek was heavily dominated by the sudden replacement of Johnston with Hood on July 17th and 18th. In that event, the Army of Tennessee lost its most respected commander, although one who did not hesitate to discipline the troops with executions for desertion, and gained a man whose capabilities were largely unknown. William J. Hardee, the only one of the Army's corps commanders with great experience in his job, was miffed at Hood's ascension to command. Hardee's colleagues, Alexander P. Stewart and Benjamin F. Cheatham, had not yet fought a battle with their new corps commands. Hood mandated an overly complex movement and echelon by divisions, and the attack took place several hours later than planned. The Confederates advanced with little information about the placement of their enemy, knew nothing of a 1.5-mile gap in Sherman's line, and were ill-informed that Sherman's left wing was closing in along the eastern approaches to Atlanta. That latter development forced Hood to curtail the fighting at Peachtree Creek earlier than anticipated. Despite these disadvantages, the Confederates brought to bear a huge preponderance of manpower upon one division of Thomas's army and found 2 gaps in the 20th Corps line as they approached the Federals south of Peachtree Creek. Their failure to exploit these advantages doomed the rebel effort that afternoon. A combination of poor Confederate troop handling, lack of offensive spirit, and very effective Union countermeasures evened the odds and resulted in a spirited Union victory. Hood completely failed in his objective, and the Army of the Cumberland achieved one more important success on the battlefield. Morale loomed large as an element in the story of Peachtree Creek. The Confederates suffered depressed spirits to a significant degree, and they were comparatively unused to offensive action thus far in the campaign. In fact, the Army of Tennessee had not conducted a major attack since the Battle of Chickamauga 10 months before. Most rebel soldiers did not know what to make of their new army commander. In contrast, the Federals had enjoyed unusually high morale for a long while before the Atlantic campaign began, and they had complete faith in Sherman's ability to conduct the risky movements necessary to approach the city. They loved and trusted Thomas. We should keep in mind that the Federals were used to winning campaigns and battles, and the Confederates were not, an important factor in assessing troop morale. In terms of battle spirit, Peachtree Creek matched the opponents at a time when the Confederates were at an important disadvantage and the Federals were, as usual, riding high. Looking objectively at the course of the fighting at Peachtree Creek, it is striking that so many Confederate brigades in William J. Hardee's corps moved forward only part way across the contested ground before stopping well short of the Union line and doing little more than firing for the rest of the afternoon. Hardee greatly outnumbered the lone 4th Corps division opposing him, commanded by John Newton, yet he utterly failed to capitalize on that unusual advantage. Even the men of Alexander P. Stewart's Army of Mississippi advancing to the left of Hardee failed to exploit the 2 gaps in Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps line. Ironically, about 1/3 of the troops in Winfield S. Featherston's Mississippi Brigade did not even attempt to move into the gap they found, choosing to remain at the captured Union skirmish line rather than advance farther toward the enemy. Although some rebel units would later attack Well on July 22nd and at Ezra Church on July 28th, Peachtree Creek marked the beginning of a deterioration of combat spirit among many other units in the Army of Tennessee. The Federals of William Ward's Union Division responded remarkably well, surging forward up a steep slope to grapple in many places hand-to-hand with Featherston's men, but they also tended to exaggerate the intensity of the fighting that developed. Ironically, Ward's 3 brigades competed with only 2/3 of Featherston's brigade in this contest. Without taking anything away from the inspired fighting conducted by Ward's division, it has to be pointed out that even in Stewart's command, a significant lack of fighting spirit hampered the Confederate effort on July 20th. Confederate fighting spirit increased after Peachtree Creek, but not in a uniform way. As the disruption caused by Johnston's relief faded and Hood endured an agonizing transition period into Army command, some units attacked with a good deal of determination on July 22nd east of Atlanta, when the Army of Tennessee came closer than at any other time in the campaign to winning an important victory over Sherman. Other units also attacked with a good deal of determination at Ezra Church on July 28th. In both engagements, however, improved morale failed to translate into tactical success, and in each of them some Confederate units failed to press home their assaults. Peachtree Creek represented the beginning of a trend in the Atlanta campaign, resulting in uneven battle spirit within Confederate ranks. As a result, the course of the campaign continued to be dominated by the Federals until the final agony at Jonesboro led to Hood's evacuation of Atlanta on September 2, 1864. Like all the battles that took place during the Atlanta campaign, Peachtree Creek held the potential for decisive results. But, like all of them, those results were not realized. It would be misleading to argue that any one engagement in this long campaign was the decisive moment in Sherman's struggle for Atlanta. Each one contributed in its own way toward shaping the course of the campaign and influencing its outcome. The purpose of this study is to determine how the Battle of July 20th affected the events in Georgia, why it became a failure for one side and a success for the other, and how the battle affected the 46,000 men directly engaged in combat that hot afternoon in late July, more than 150 years ago. I wish to thank all the staff members of the archival institutions for their assistance in making their valuable holdings accessible during the course of gathering material for this book. Also a note of thanks to all the graduate student researchers who aided me in accessing material at archives I was unable to visit personally. The two scholars who read the manuscript for the University of North Carolina Press, Peter S. Carmichael and A. Wilson Green, deserve a deep note of thanks from me for their helpful suggestions. Most of all, my deep gratitude to my wife Pratibha for all she means to me. 1. To the Chattahoochee. I am getting very wearied of this eternal retiring. W.H.T. Walker. By the middle of July 1864, the Atlantic campaign had stretched into the longest and most grueling military effort in the Civil War's Western theater. Major General William T. Sherman had started from the vicinity of Chattanooga with some 100,000 men organized as an army group. Major General George H. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was the largest of the three armies in this group, with about 60,000 men, and Major General James B. McPherson's Army of the Tennessee consisted of about 30,000 men after the 17th Corps joined it in early June. Major General John M. Schofield's Army of the Ohio, consisting only of the 23rd Corps, was the smallest of the three, with about 10,000 troops. These three armies were drawn from the military departments embraced by Sherman's command, the Military Division of the Mississippi. Sherman had benefited from the tutelage of Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, who now served as General-in-Chief of the United States Army. Grant made his headquarters with Major General George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac so as to direct its operations against General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in the east. His conduct of the overland campaign astonished the country with its fierce attacks against Lee's well-fortified positions. In driving south from the Wilderness to Petersburg, Grant lost 64,000 troops in 6 weeks of rugged campaigning, inflicting a proportionate number of casualties on Lee and laying semi-siege to an important rail center 30 miles south of Richmond. Sherman admired Grant's aggressive approach to the thorny problem posed by Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, but he also was stunned by the human cost of that approach. He preferred a more cautious method of dealing with General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of Tennessee, which consisted of about 60,000 men after Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk joined Johnston in mid-May with his Army of Mississippi. Polk's command essentially formed a third corps for Johnston's army, even though it technically constituted an independent force drawn from the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. Sherman crafted an effective strategy, working it out through trial and error during the course of the Atlantic campaign. The foundation of that strategy was maneuver, for his larger force had many opportunities to find either of Johnston's flanks whenever the Confederates took up a fortified position. Sherman experimented with several attacks, but they always were local rather than general in nature. Localized attacks tended to minimize casualties and reduce the resonance of failure. They never neutralized Sherman's ability to continue operations after they failed. In contrast, Grant tended to attack more often and trusted too much on general assaults. He often gave little time to Meade for planning these massive efforts, and too little attention was paid to heavy skirmishing and trying to reach Lee's flanks in subtle movements. Of course, the well-known vigilance and aggressive tactics that characterized Lee's handling of the Army of Northern Virginia in previous campaigns contributed to Grant's sense of urgency. He could ill afford to be idle or complacent in front of the Army of Northern Virginia. But the result of Grant's campaign thus far was apparent stalemate outside Petersburg, with a military force that had lost about half the men in its ranks when it started the overland campaign. The military effectiveness of the Army of the Potomac had been severely reduced by June and July, greatly contributing to the slow pace and often failed offensives of Grant's efforts at Petersburg. Just as Lee's reputation and conduct contributed to the nature of Grant's operations in Virginia, the reputation and conduct of Joseph E. Johnston helped to shape the way Sherman conducted the Atlantic campaign. The two commanders had met before in the Jackson campaign that followed the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863. At that time, Grant sent Sherman with a sizable force to deal with Johnston's troops, who later constituted the core of Polk's Army of Mississippi during the Atlantic campaign. Johnston refused to offer battle to Sherman as he fell back from the Big Black River 28 miles to Jackson, having already failed to mount an effective effort to relieve the siege of Vicksburg, despite urgent entreaties from authorities in Richmond to do so. Johnston acted strictly on the defensive in the short campaign for Jackson, preferring to rely on the ring of fortifications that barely protected the capital of Mississippi. When Sherman made moves to cross the Pearl River and cut off his retreat east of the city, Johnston evacuated Jackson on the night of July 16th. The Jackson campaign was a foretaste of Johnston's handling of the Army of Tennessee in the Union drive toward Atlanta. While Sherman retained a healthy respect for Johnston's skill as an army administrator, he knew that his opponent was not an aggressive tactician. As long as he could maintain his tenuous line of communications, a rail line stretching 350 miles to Louisville, and keep his army intact, Sherman could afford to take his time in approaching Atlanta. Several rivers not only posed obstacles to Sherman's advance, but marked geographic divisions along his march toward Atlanta. The Oostenaula River, which flowed from northeast toward the southwest near Resaca, about 20 miles south of Chattanooga, marked the limit of Appalachian terrain. The area north of this stream consisted of high ridges that dominated the countryside, but Sherman had little difficulty maneuvering through it, using the long ridges to shield his flanking movements around the imposing Confederate positions. The Etowah River, draining toward the west some 40 miles south of Chattanooga, marked the limit of a transition zone between Appalachia and the Piedmont. This was an area of more open and fertile country, also posing few difficulties to Sherman's advance. When the Federals crossed the Etowah River on May 23rd, temporarily cutting away from the railroad, they entered a Piedmont region of rolling terrain often engulfed with thick pine forests and dotted by isolated villages. This territory slowed Sherman enormously and aided Johnston's defensive tactics. The Federals often did not discover their enemy until within a few yards of their works, and Sherman's massive army group found it difficult to maneuver across the narrow, primitive roads. When rain set in, the situation grew worse, and Federal progress slowed to a crawl. Only by working their way in short stages were the Unionists able to regain the railroad by June 7th. Then Sherman continued to move in short stages southward until forcing Johnston onto the dominating heights of Kennesaw Mountain. He again experimented by launching a major attack, the largest of the campaign, on June 27th. His 15,000 troops hardly dented the Confederates' well-constructed earthen line and suffered 3,000 casualties in the attempt. Only when he mounted a major movement away from the railroad to turn Johnston's left flank did the Confederates give up Kennesaw Mountain and fall back on July 2nd. Johnston now gave up ground in smaller increments, exhibiting more determination to make his Fabian tactics work by tenaciously holding every possible defensive position. He fell back from the Kennesaw Mountain line only a short distance to Smyrna Station, giving up that line on July 4th and taking up the Chattahoochee River line along the north bank of that stream. It took Sherman 2 months to get this far, 90 miles on a straight line from Chattanooga and only 10 miles north of Atlanta. Along the way, the Federals lost about 21,000 men, and Johnston suffered about 9,000 casualties, far less than the Union and Confederate losses in Virginia. But Sherman's success thus far should not be underestimated. He had pried enemy forces out of 10 fortified positions and was busy devising ways to eject them from the 11th line. After that, the crossing of the Chattahoochee River itself represented an event of symbolic importance. It was, in a sense, Sherman's Rubicon. Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon River in 49 B.C. had been a major event in Roman history. As the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, he was forbidden by law to take his troops across the border of that province and toward Rome, or risk being branded an enemy of the state. In crossing the river to seize power, Caesar knew he had to either win or suffer the worst consequences. For Sherman, the stakes were not so high, but once south of the Chattahoochee, he could not go back across the river except after capturing Atlanta. To be driven back to the north side would be rightfully seen as a major military defeat with potentially dire consequences for the Northern war effort as a whole. Once across, the Federals had to whip Johnston decisively or drive him out of the city by other means to make a success of the Atlanta campaign. Sherman dealt with the Chattahoochee River line the same way he had dealt with the other 10 Confederate positions, by threatening the flanks. He crossed a small force to the south side of the river at Isham's Ford, upstream from both the railroad bridge and Johnston's right flank, on July 8th. This was enough for Johnston to order his army to evacuate the line on the night of July 9th. Like most of the previous evacuations, it was conducted relatively smoothly and without interference from the enemy, who did not know it had taken place until the early morning hours. But Johnston failed to tenaciously block the many crossing points of the river. Instead, he pulled his troops close to Atlanta for rest and to watch enemy developments. This gave ample room for Sherman to create bridgeheads on the south side of the Chattahoochee at several locations with virtually no interference. Brigadier General Kenner Gerard's cavalry division crossed at Roswell about 12 miles upstream from the railroad bridge on July 9th. By the next day, Schofield's 23rd Corps crossed at the mouth of Soap Creek, using Isham's Ford to get across the stream. On July 12th, Major General David S. Stanley's 4th Corps Division, Army of the Cumberland, crossed at Isham's Ford and moved more than 3 miles south to secure the bluffs on the east side of the Chattahoochee River opposite Powers Ferry, making that crossing available to Sherman as well. After the 58th Indiana laid a pontoon bridge at Powers Ferry, Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood's 4th Corps Division crossed it to join Stanley on the south side. Brigadier General John Newton's division of the 4th Corps crossed the river at Roswell on July 13th and moved down to join Stanley and Wood. Within 4 days of Johnston's drawback to the south side of the Chattahoochee, Sherman had all of Major General Oliver O. Howard's 4th Corps, the entire Army of the Ohio, and Gerard's cavalry division on the Confederate side of the river. The Federals possessed a connected bridgehead from Isham's Ford to Powers Ferry that was more than 3 miles wide, plus an isolated bridgehead at Roswell 6 miles farther upstream. Howard and Schofield had access to a road network that reached from the river out toward road junctions at Cross Keys and Buckhead due north of Atlanta. Those junctions gave access to roads running in nearly any direction. Increasing his presence on the south side, Sherman moved Major General Grenville M. Dodge's left wing, 16th Corps, over the river at Roswell by July 14th to enlarge that bridgehead. He also extended cavalry troops south of the railroad bridge as far as Baker's Ferry, some 7 miles downstream. The Federal Army group stretched for some 20 miles along the north side of the Chattahoochee River, with 2 important bridgeheads on the south side. As historian Thomas L. Connolly has rightly pointed out, Johnston did nothing to stop Sherman from gaining control of useful crossings of the Chattahoochee River. Judging by his performance, the Confederate commander intended to continue his passive resistance to Sherman's advance, await developments, and fight from behind chosen positions. Johnston posted his cavalry to watch the Federals north of Atlanta, given that the bridgeheads held by Howard, Schofield, Dodge, and Gerard portended a major move north of the railroad bridge. Brigadier General John H. Kelly, commander of a cavalry division, took Colonel George G. Debrell's brigade to Cross Keys by July 10th. To Debrell's left, Kelly positioned Brigadier General John S. Williams's cavalry brigade some distance north of Buckhead and straddling the road between that place and Roswell. Still farther to Williams's left, Kelly positioned Colonel Robert H. Anderson's cavalry brigade so that Anderson's left flank touched the Chattahoochee near the mouth of Long Island Creek. Major General Joseph Wheeler, who commanded the Cavalry Corps, Army of Tennessee, was responsible for the overall positioning of these mounted units under Johnston's general direction. They were posted to guard against a major Union move south from Roswell, but were in position so as to quickly confront any Federal move out of the Isham's Ford Powers Ferry bridgehead as well. Johnston's directions to Wheeler were simple. Please watch the force you mention as on this side of the river, and whenever it moves forward, impede its march as much as you can, destroying bridges after you. Give notice of all the roads by which they march also. Despite the missed opportunity inherent in failing to block these crossing points of the river with large infantry forces, Johnston displayed an air of calm routine in posting his cavalry and issuing orders. But his withdrawal across the Chattahoochee caused anything but calm among the residents of Atlanta. Our presence on the south side of the Chattahoochee created considerable alarm, wrote Irenus Watson Landingham, a member of Lieutenant General John Bell Hood's Corps staff, and the good people of that city have been getting to the rear in a hurry. As soon as he settled the Army of Tennessee south of the river and just a short distance north of the city, Johnston ordered surplus government stores removed from Atlanta to safer locations south. This logical step simply increased the sense of panic among the citizens. News of the shifting of stores also penetrated the rank and file, and led many soldiers to wonder if Johnston had any intention of fighting for possession of the city. J. Walker Coleman of the 1st Tennessee was not surprised to learn that the residents despaired of their safety and were trying to leave Atlanta. Many officers shared Coleman's view. Major General W. H. T. Walker, who commanded a division in Lieutenant General William J. Hardee's corps, was convinced that the civilians had become disheartened by Johnston's fallback from Dalton to the gates of Atlanta, but he assured his daughter that most of his men were still in good heart and willing to fight. Johnston paid no attention to public opinion as he calmly prepared for the future. After crossing the Chattahoochee, he concentrated on improving the city line that encircled Atlanta. Started the previous summer of 1863 and laid out and supervised by engineer Captain Lemuel P. Grant, only the basic trench line studded with many forts on high ground existed when the Army of Tennessee crossed the river. Johnston told his chief engineer to assist Grant in the improvements, including cutting embrasures so the artillery could be protected from enemy sharpshooters. He also asked for the shipment of several heavy guns from Mobile and selected an outer line north of the city line to oppose the Federals when they moved down from Roswell and Powers Ferry. Johnston gave indication that he intended to hold the city as long as possible, and that the city line could be made a formidable position, barring Sherman's entry into Atlanta. But the city's supply lines were vulnerable. Johnston had been unable to prevent Sherman from outflanking him thus far in the campaign, and there was every reason to believe the Federal commander would continue using maneuver and flanking rather than frontal attacks as his modus operandi once he moved south of the Chattahoochee. In fact, Sherman had no intention of battering his army group against Grant's line of fortifications. As early as June 30th, he had informed his wife that he would operate against the city's lines of communication instead of against its earthworks. Sherman expressed it well to Major General Henry W. Halleck, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, when he wrote on July 6th that, "Instead of attacking Atlanta direct or any of its forts, I propose to make a circuit, destroying all its railroads. This is a delicate movement and must be done with caution." The presence of 3 corps and 1 cavalry division at Roswell and Powers Ferry telegraphed to the enemy that Sherman intended to move on the city from the north. Was there an alternative? Major General Jacob D. Cox, who commanded a division in Schofield's 23rd Corps, carefully examined that question after the war. Cox noted that 2 railroads entered Atlanta from the south. The Atlanta and West Point Railroad came from Montgomery, Alabama, and joined the Macon and Western Railroad at East Point, 6 miles south of the city. From there, traffic on both roads used the track of the Macon and Western Railroad into Atlanta. The Georgia Railroad entered Atlanta from the east, coming from Augusta, Georgia, while the Western and Atlantic Railroad, already in Federal hands, came from Chattanooga, northwest of Atlanta. Cox envisioned the possibility of Sherman crossing the Chattahoochee River downstream from the railroad bridge. Such a crossing would have given him a relatively short march to reach the railroad south of Atlanta. But Cox foresaw that then Johnston could have relied on the Georgia Railroad and his connection with Augusta. The Confederate commander could also have given up Atlanta and defended every town on the Georgia Railroad as he retired toward Augusta. Missing from Cox's analysis, however, was the knowledge that Johnston had positioned 2 of his corps, Hardee's and Hood's, to the northwest of Atlanta. They could have quickly confronted any Union move toward the railroad south of the city. Moreover, Sherman feared that a major crossing downstream from the railroad bridge would expose his own line of communications to a Confederate cavalry force that crossed the Chattahoochee north of the bridge. Moreover, he always had to keep in mind a significant threat. Robert E. Lee might be able to detach troops from the Army of Northern Virginia and use the Confederate rail network to shift reinforcements to Johnston. If so, those troops would likely arrive by way of the Georgia Railroad rather than by the southern route to Atlanta. The strategic situation as well as the tactical environment therefore seemed to dictate a move upstream of the railroad bridge, an approach from the north, and an attempt to cut the Georgia Railroad before hitting the other lines. The difficulties of this approach were apparent to Sherman, and Cox explained them well in his post-war history of the campaign. Atlanta lay on high ground that constituted the watershed of terrain draining north toward the Chattahoochee River and south toward the Ocmulgee River. But the ground north of Atlanta did not drain directly into the river. It mostly drained into Peachtree Creek, which ran generally east to west about 4 miles north of Atlanta. The creek dominated the area and represented a good defensive position for the Confederates. It emptied into the Chattahoochee River just upstream from the railroad bridge, where its mouth was, in Cox's words, a wide and muddy bed. Not only did the creek pose a serious obstacle to the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?